Hey guys, and welcome to our next React project. Now in this project, we're going to be creating an application for the company City Tours. Now the City Tours is offering different tours in the different cities, hence the name of City Tours. Now in our application, we're going to be displaying the tours for the user to choose. And also if the user wants to get more info, he can just click the info button and then he can read more info about the specific tour. Now, if the user is not interested in reading the info, we can just hide the info. Also, if there is too much of selection, the user can just get rid of one of the tours, and that makes his selection easier. Now, obviously, we're just using the data locally, so once we're going to refresh, then all the tours are going to be again become visible. Now, in this project, we will going to work with three components. We're going to look at making a nav bar, and then this would be a tour list. And obviously each and every card is going to be the actual tour component. Now to make things more interesting, in this project, we're going to look at a few ways how we can add images to a Create React app. Also, we're going to look at how we can get and use Google Fonts, Font Awesome for the icons, and also Sass. Now, those of you who don't know, Sass is CSS preprocessor. And don't worry if you haven't worked with one. We're going to start with a very basics. And we're going to add the Sass using the Node Sass module. And last but not least, we're going to look at how we can publish our application online. So after the hard working of building this application, we're going to look at it, how we can post it on the Netlify for free so the whole world can see what you just created. Now, once we know what we're going to be doing, let's get after it. In order to do a quick setup, we're going to use the Create React app. So let me go to a terminal. Let me maximize this so you can see it better. And what I would want is to navigate to a desktop so I can see the desktop. And once I'm going to be in the desktop, let's use the Create React app. So Create React app, and let's name our application, or the folder for this case. Let's name this City Tours. So we can just call this City Tours. Now, once the Create React app is doing all the installation, let me show you what you can find in the setup files. Now, the setup files are not necessary in a sense that you can always put your own information. However, they also give you a quick start, so you don't have to go looking for the images, for example, because as you notice, I have 4 images. We're going to have London, New York, Paris, and Tokyo. Now, also apart from the images, there's going to be a logo. So there's going to be a logo PNG, and in the tour data, we're going to have our possible 4 tours. Now, obviously, if you would want to extend it, and if you would want to make, let's say, 20 tours, the logic behind it is still going to be the same. So you would just have to go back here and add more items in this array. Because as you notice, this is structured as an array, and we're just exporting this array, and each item in the array is going to be an object with an ID, with city, image. Now, also, as you're adding more items, you're also going to have to look for the items, unless you want to reuse the same items. However, it's probably not going to make sense if you have a city tour in the Boston and you are again using the New York image. So every time you're going to be adding a new item in this array, it would also make sense if you would get a new image. Now, again, I just used 4 items here because I didn't see the point of getting 20. Because again, the logic is going to work the same whether it's going to be 1, 2, 20, or 200 items. So this is what you can find in the setup files. And once the install is going to be done, then we're going to pick it up from here, and then we're going to start working on the project. Now that the Create React app has finished an install, you can see that the only thing we need to do is again navigate to a folder or the directory that we have, which would be City Tours. So once we navigate to a City Tours, I would want to open up the folder in my text editor, And once I open up the folder, I also would want to open up the new browser window, just so we can work side by side. And here, let me open up the new browser window. And within the Visual Studio Code, we have integrated terminal, which we can access again with Control and tilde, or the key left from the one key. And then let's write that we would want to npm start, which is gonna start our development server. Now, once we type npm start, notice we're gonna have our development server on the local host 3000, and we can start working on the project. Now, the first thing that I would want to do in the project is do a little bit of cleanup, because it is again a bootstrap, so there's things that are necessary. And also I would want to install the Google Fonts, the Font Awesome icons, and Node Sass. So let's go to a source folder, because we're going to leave all the other folders alone for now. And let's clean it up. Let's say that for the app CSS, we're not interested in anything that we're given by default. So we're just going to keep this a empty file. Now after that, and you know what, let me just save this. Now after that, we're going to go to index CSS, and we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to delete all our default styles. So again, let me save the index CSS, and this should be completely empty. And our next task is going to be getting rid of this logo SVG, and let's just delete this guy over. And let's just bravely say move to a trash. Now after that, obviously our application is going to break, because we are expecting the logo SVG. So let's go to app.js, and let's just remove this import with a logo. And also within the app, let's delete everything including the div. And let's say that this is going to be a heading 1 with a hello from app. And now once I save it, everything should be working fine, and we should have this blank file with a hello from app. And like I said, now I would want to do our setup, where we get the Google Fonts, where we get the Node Sass, and also where we get the Font Awesome icons. So let's go back to a previous video files where I said that we're going to be looking for Google Fonts. Now, for looking for Google Fonts is very easy. We just go to Google, type Google Fonts, and we are given all the fonts in the world that we would want. Now, in this project, I'm going to be using the Open Sans, so we can just go to Open Sans, click adding. Now notice that it says that family has been selected, and now we have either option of embedding it or customizing it even more. So if you want more bolder, you just need to click it over here. Now in my case, I wouldn't want that, so I'm just going to say that I would want to embed it. And for embedding, we also have two options. We have option of importing, or we can just have a link. Now in my case, we're just going to use the link. So let me just copy and paste this link. And the question is where we're going to copy and paste it to, because we have the source folder and also we have node modules and public. Now we would want to place this in the public in the index.html, because we're going to have our HTML file. And notice after the meta pass, we're going to have some kind of comments, and this would be the title of the React app. Now in this case, we're going to say city tours. So this is going to be the name of the application. And let me add a comment that this is going to be Google Fonts. Now once we have this, let me copy and paste this, but don't close this yet, because we're going to add this font family later on to a body. But before we do that, I would want to install the Node Sass first, because this is just going to make a little bit more sense. So just keep this open like this. Don't close it, because we're going to be reusing this later on, literally in like 1 or 2 minutes. Now once we have the Google Fonts, next one would be Font Awesome. And again, Font Awesome, we're going to use the CDN, so Content Delivery Network, and we're going to, again, just include the link. So right after the Google Fonts, let's write that there's going to be a Font Awesome over here, and let's go to a Font Awesome. And again, it's easy as just going to Google, looking for the Font Awesome, and then we're going to have our icons ready. Now within the website, we would be looking for the start. So basically how we can start working with a Font Awesome icons. And it's really as easy as it gets. The first thing, you right away have the link for your Font Awesome if you want to include it in the project. Now you have an option of downloading it, but we're just going to skip this because this is going to be the fastest way. Now, right after the font awesome, let's just copy and paste this. And now we should have the access to font awesome. Now, later on, as we're working with a project, if something technically would go bad, because I'm not going to test this right now because I want to move along, then I'm going to go back and we're going to figure out if there's some kind of mistake. But unless, I don't know, the earth is flat, then everything should be fine. So again, let me save this. This would be our index HTML. So now we have added the Google fonts, and also we have added the font awesome. So now this would be the fun part where we're adding the node Sass. And again, for those of you who don't know Sass, Sass allows us to work with a CSS in more powerful ways. I mean, this would be probably the simplest explanation. And again, if you've never worked with Sass, that's fine. I'm going to start with a very basics. And it's not like it's a whole complete another computer language or anything like that. There's just some tips and tricks how it can speed up our workflow. So let's close the index HTML. Let's go to our integrated terminal. And now we have our npm running, meaning our dev service running. However, I would want to stop it for now. And we would want to install a package. Now, the package that we would want to install is going to be npm. And again, let me zoom in so you can see better. So we're going to have npm. Then we would want to install. So we can just write I for short. And then the name is going to be node. And once we're going to type node, then we would need to write dash. And then we're going to write Sass. Now, last but not least, we're just going to have 2 dashes and we're going to write save. So this is going to save it as our development dependency. So once we do that, you notice that the install is starting. And if we're going to go to our package JSON, once the installation has been completed, and you notice that now it's not a very great thing, the fact that I have zoomed in, we should have in our dev dependencies the node Sass. And this would be almost the end of our setup. However, I would also want to rename the app CSS and the index CSS to a Sass extensions. And then we're just going to add a little bit of code. And notice that once we're done with a installation, we have the dependencies, we have the React DOM, and here we're going to have our node Sass. And once we're done with an install, we can again start running the server. So npm start, and our server or development server has started running it. Now let me minimize a little bit here the integrated terminal. And like I said, in the app CSS, in the index CSS, we would want first of all rename them to have the Sass extensions. So let's start with the index CSS. So let's rename it not just to a CSS, but let's add S in the front of CSS. And you notice how the Visual Studio Code right away changed the icon from the CSS. Now it knows that this is going to be Sass. Now, once we have the index ready, this is going to break because we have the import in the index.js as a index CSS. So let me go back. So let me show you that we have the index CSS. Now, obviously, since we are changing the extension for the index CSS, we also would need to change the import. So we're going to write that this is going to be a CSS. So now everything should be working. And again, we get back our setup files. Then also let's do the same thing with an app CSS. And let me first of all rename this. Let's say that this is going to be a Sass extension, first and foremost. And then again, we need to do the same thing in the app.js, where we need to rename the import. Because again, we are importing not the CSS anymore. So once we have done these two things, let me go to a index CSS, or not CSS, the actual Sass extension. And let's add a few rules, few basic rules that will going to help us throughout the project. And once we're going to be done with this basic setup, then we're going to be able to start moving to our first component, which is going to be the navbar. Now, first things first, in the index, I would want to write that I would want to select all the elements that we're going to be creating. And I would want to give them a margin of 0, a padding of 0. And what we're doing is we're just getting rid of all the default styles. So there's going to be no default browser styles. And last but not least, we're going to have a box sizing. and the box sizing is going to be the border box. Now, why we're using the border box? Well, the border box allows us to add the padding to the element, and the size of an element does not change. Because if you don't have the box sizing of a border box, if you're going to add the padding to an element, the element is actually going to grow. So let's say you have an element with 200 pixels by 200 pixels. If you're going to add extra padding, just go and check it out. You're going to have the element that is bigger. It's not anymore 200 by 200. So that's the reason for adding this box sizing border box. And after that, we're going to have a very, very nice Sass feature, which is the fact that we can create our own variables. Now, how do we create the variables and why we want to create the variables? Now, I'm going to use my variables for the colors. And the way we're going to create the variables is going to be $. Then we need to have the name of the variable, which is in my case going to be black. And then now we would need to give it a value. Now, in my case, for the black, I'm just going to say 222. Now, the actual 222 seems pretty simple, correct? However, since we're going to be adding some other colors, and since we would want to add this color as we're working throughout the project, I don't want to go back and say, well, okay, so this is going to be hashtag 20B78. I would want to say, you know what, this is going to be main black, main green, main white, main yellow, whatever. So this is just going to make this easier. Now, you can also call this primary black or primary white. It's really, you can do it however you would want. The main idea is to have this $, and then name your variables. And you're not limited just to colors, but we're just going to use this for colors. And the second one is going to be main green. And then we're going to have main white and main gray. So let's rewrite this main white and let's do main gray. So once we have these values, let me also change the values for the main green, main white, and main gray. And for the main green, this is going to be a hashtag, then 82B, 340. So 340. So this is going to be our green color. Then let's go with a main white. Now the main white is going to be hashtag FFF. And last but not least, we're going to have the main gray of hashtag EC. So this is going to be our main gray. Now, once we're done with setting up the colors, I would want to work with a whole body. And just to test it out whether our Sass extension is working correctly, let's do like this. Let's say background is going to be main gray. So now we have the option for the value. Now you notice that Visual Studio Code gives us a nice code hints, but we're not going to use them. We will going to say that we would want to select a, again, $, and now notice we have access to the variables that we created before. Now you can also do this with a CSS custom properties, and I have been doing in my other project. But in this case, we're just going to look at a Sass. So just to see that everything is working, let's do that the main color for the background is going to be the gray, and the color is going to be the green one. Again, we're going to change these values later on, but again, $, and main green. Now, before we're done with index CSS, let me go to Google Fonts, and I would want to add fonts family for the whole project of Open Sans. So let me copy and paste this. And this is why I said you shouldn't be closing the window. So we're going to go back and we're going to save this. And now notice our background is going to be gray. Our color is going to be green. And also our fonts are working. So far so good. Everything has been set up. Now, like I said, we will going to change these values. So we're just going to say main white. And for the color, we're just going to use a main black. So pretty boring, but works for this simple project over here. So once we're done with a setup, next we are ready to move on and start working on our first component, which is going to be a navbar. Now our navbar is going to look like this, where we're going to have the logo, and then here we're going to have the links. Now the links are not going to go anywhere because we haven't covered the React router yet. So let's go ahead and let's start working on this navbar. So first things first, let me open up again the sidebar where we can see the folder and the file structure. And you know what? We can just close the index CSS because we're not going to use it anymore, as well as app CSS. And I keep calling this CSS, but you understand that I'm talking about the Sass files in this case. And once we're going to have the index.js, we're also not going to need it. because the only thing that's happening is the React DOM render, the app component that we are importing from the app.js. So again, we have covered this before, so this is not interesting. Now within the app.js, we're going to get our navbar. But where we're going to create our navbar component? Well, we know that we can create our components in the separate file. So let's go to a source, and within the source, let's create a new folder of components. Now, once we have this folder, now within this folder, there's going to be 3 other folders that we're going to be creating. And again, you're going to see throughout the project why we're creating separate folders for each component, not just separate files. And the first one is going to be a navbar. So let's write new folder, and we're just going to say that this is going to be a navbar. Now within the navbar, there's going to be 2 files. Now the first one is going to be navbar.js. So we're going to call this navbar.js. And then we would want also the Sass file. So within the navbar, let's say there's going to be new file, and this is going to be navbar. And now we would need to write again S, and then we're going to say CSS. So this is going to be again for the styling on for the Sass. Now before we start doing anything in the navbar.js, we know that we have snippets available. So we don't have to again write the whole boilerplate. And since we're not going to have a state in this component, we can just write RFC, which would stand for functional component. And just like that, we have our functional component. Now, since we will going to be using the styling from this Sass file, we also would want to import it right away, this Sass file. And the way we do that, again, we would need to show the path. And the path is going to be in the same folder. So we can just write that there's going to be a navbar. And this is going to be with a capital letter. And here, again, we have our Sass extension. So now, once we have our Sass ready to go, once we have our navbar.js to go, let's just write some kind of information in here so we know that we are working with this navbar. So the actual import is working fine. So within a div, we can just write hello from navbar. And now we would want to import this navbar in our app.js, because this is where all our components are going to meet. Because later on, we're going to have the tour list, we're going to have the tour. Now the tour is going to be imported to the tour. But anyway, we know that all our components, in our case, 2 our major components, are going to meet in here. Now, again, we would need to do the import, and we should be looking for this navbar.js. Now, where are we looking for? Well, we have the components, so we need to look for the folder that is what? In the source. So we have 1.2many. Since this is a relative path, this is within the same source folder where the app.js is. So we're looking for the components. Now within the components, we have the navbar folder. Now within the navbar folder, we have the navbar.js. Now, like I said before, since this is a JavaScript extension, then we don't have to use the extension here. The Webpack is going to know that we are looking for the JS file. Now, since we're looking sometimes for the Sass or CSS files, then we need to specifically write what we're looking for. And right after the hello app, or you know what, let's just delete this hello app and let's just go with a navbar. So this is going to be our navbar. However, we need to name it. We did the import where we had the export default of navbar, but we also need to name it as we're importing. So I apologize, I didn't do that. So this is going to be import, and we're going to be importing from, and now we would want to use this. So let's write over here navbar, and this is going to be our component. And if everything works correctly, this is going to be our navbar component. So once we're done with a setup, again, let me close the side. Let me switch from the app.js to a navbar.js, and now let's start actual work. Now within a navbar component, we would first want to create a nav element. So we're going to write a simple HTML element nav. Now, obviously, we're working within the JSX, but I will going to be referencing this as the HTML. Now, the nav is going to have the class, so we're going to have a class name, since we know that we cannot use the class directly in the JSX, and the class name is going to be the navbar. Now, within the nav, first thing we have is, in fact, an image. So we have the image, and for all the images, we need source. So where are we getting this image from? And like I said, this is going to be the first way how we can get images in the Create React app. Now let's go back to a setup file where we have the image. So we have the logo PNG. And again, if you want to create your own image, that's fine. Or if you want to get it online, it doesn't really matter. So as long as you have something that you can actually get it to your application. So I'm just going to say copy, or you can drag and drop. It doesn't really matter. And let's go back to a city tours. So this is our working Create React application. And then within the source, anywhere within the source, let's just paste this logo PNG. So now we have copy and pasted logo PNG. And one of the ways how we can get images in the Create React app is the same how we're doing with a rest of the components or files that we would want. And that is importing. So we're going to write import. And now we would need to look where is that image. Now the image is, again, let me show you the sidebar. It is in a source folder. It is not in the navbar folder or even in components folder. It is in fact in a source folder. Now, since this would be a relative path, we would want to leave the components folder, or I'm sorry, navbar folder. Then we would want to leave the components folder. And then last but not least, we would be looking for the logo PNG. So we know we have the name of logo PNG. So let's write logo PNG. And let's also name it here, because this is going to make our life easier. And let's just call this logo from PNG. So in this case, we are importing logo. And again, we can name this however we would like. The main thing is that we're importing this image. And now for the source, let's use that logo. So since I'm in JSX, if I have the curly braces, we're just going to say that we would be importing logo. Now let's also write that this would be city tours logo. And let's not forget to enclose this, even though this would be a single tag. And once we do that, notice we have our first image. Now, like I said, when we're going to be working with the tours, we're going to look at the other way how we can use images. Now, this would be one way where we just import it from, whether that would be a different folder or folder 2 levels deep. It doesn't really matter. As long as we are importing it correctly, we should have access to it. Now, after the image, we're going to have a unordered list. Now, the unordered list is going to have a class of nav links. And within the nav links, we're going to have our links. And we're going to type over here list item. And within the list item, there's going to be a link. So let me just close this UL. And within a list item, we're going to write that there is going to be a link with a class name of nav link. Now for the href, we're going to do a /. So we're not going to do a hashtag. And here for the first link, we're going to write that the link is going to be called home. So this is going to be home. So sure enough, now we have our home. And only thing that's left to do is to go to a copy and pasting where we'll have a list item. So let's just copy and paste it 2 times where we're going to have a home. Next one is going to be about. And then after that, we're going to have tours. Now for the tours, which is going to be the last one, we're just going to say that there's going to be a class of active. And we're just going to do a little bit of different styling for the class of active. So this would be our JSX or our component setup for the navbar. So now what's left to do is go to navbar SAS file and style this. So let's go back over here and let's style this. And let's start styling by the actual navbar. So let's say navbar, since we know that we had a class. Remember, we had a class of navbar, and let's style this navbar. And let's start very simple. Let's say background, and the background is going to be main black. Remember, we had an option of main black. However, this is going to break, and I'm going to show you in literally 2 seconds why this is going to break. But notice what happens as you're saving it. Now it says that it does have undefined variable main black. Now, as we're working with a SAS, we need to import if we want to use these variables. Now, where are the variables? They are in the index CSS. Now, in general, you would be creating a separate file for the variables, but since we don't have many, we're just going to be importing this index SAS file. So let's go back to a navbar, and let's go to the top, and let's say that we would want to import. So we're going to write import. And again, here, this would be a relative path. So we need to leave the navbar component. We need to leave the components folder. And then we're going to be looking for the index. And then notice we'll have a suggestion. Now, don't forget to place a semicolon. Otherwise, again, this is not going to work. And once we're going to save this, notice what happens. Now everything is working. And now we can reuse these variables all throughout the project. Again, the variables are very, very nice feature from the Sass. Now let's do a little bit of padding. So let's say padding 0.5 rem. So top, bottom, left and right. This is going to be 1 rem. After that, let's display it as a grid. So we're going to say very easy. We're going to say display, and we're going to be displaying grid. Now this display grid is going to affect only the direct children component. Now, what are our direct children components? Well, one of them is going to be the image. So the first one is going to be the image. And the second one is going to be all our links. So not the separate links. We're going to work with them later, but the whole unordered list. So if I'm going to say display grid, and then later on we would want to specifically say what would be our column relationship. So let's say grid. We have the property for that, grid template columns. And then we need to specifically say how big should be the first one and second column. Now the first one is going to be the auto, because this is an image. So we really don't want it to shrink or to expand. We just want it to stay the normal size that it is right now. So auto. And the second one is going to be one fraction. Now one fraction is going to make sure that it takes up all the space that's left there. So notice that we have the image and the unordered list takes up the rest of the space. Now, once we're done with a navbar, now we would want to style the nav links. Now, again, what is nav links? If we're going to go back to our navbar.js, nav links is our unordered list. So what we would want to do with a unordered list? Well, first of all, we would want to align itself in the center, because we were going to do a display of grid for this nav link, and they were going to be smaller than this image, but we would want them to line up exactly side by side. Notice how they are actually right in the center of this image. And for this, we have a property in the grid. Whenever we're using the grid, align self, and let's call this center. After that, we would want to get rid of these annoying dots that we have here. So we're going to stay list style type, and let's write none. So notice now the dots are gone. After that, like I said, we don't want them to be stacked on top of each other. So we can do the same thing like we did for the whole navbar, where we have a display, and we're just going to call this grid. So now we're displaying this as a grid, and we would want to create 3 equal columns. So again, we will need to use the property of grid template columns. Only in this case, we're not going to write auto, 1 fraction, or 20 pixels. We're going to use the function, and we have the repeat function. Now the repeat function is going to take 2 values. First one is going to be how many columns, which in our case is going to be 3. Now, if you have more links, obviously you would need to change this. And the second one is going to be the size. Now, 1 fraction means that this is just going to be distributed equally. So all of them are going to be same exact size if we're using this 1 fraction value. And last but not least, we're going to do a text align and center. And now all our links are aligned in the center. Now we're not done, because we also have a nav link. So we had a class of nav link. Again, let me show you. This would be here in the navbar. So we have the nav link, and this is what we would want to style. So let's write nav link, and then let's add a color. The color is going to be, now we can again access main, and instead of main black, we're going to say main gray. And we have access to these values because we have imported these variables. Then let's transform the text a little bit. Text transform, capitalize. Then we're going to have the text decoration none. I would want to get rid of these underlines, so text decoration none. And then we'll want to increase the font size. So font size 1.2 rems. And let's do a little bit of transition, because as I'm hovering, I would want to change the color. So notice as I'm hovering, the color changes to green. However, I would want that change to happen over time. So for this, we have a transition, and this would be a shorthand. Now we have, again, the short transition property, the transition timing, and the way it's happening. So this would be a shorthand where we have a transition. So the first value is what properties, and we're just going to say the all properties. Then the next one is going to be how long, and we're going to say 0.3 seconds. And then how the transition is going to take place, and we're just going to say linear. Now, what is going to change? Well, again, within the Sass, we have something called nesting. So we have a nav link, and we would want to apply nav link hover. So normally in the CSS, you would, again, need to write new set of curly braces, and you need to write nav link, colon, and hover. Now, in this case, since we're using Sass, we can just do the ampersand. And then since we're using the ampersand, we can just say hover. And now what is going to be hovering? Well, as we're hovering, we know that we're going to be hovering over the link. So since we have nested this right away understands that we're talking about this nav link. So we're going to write color, and let's write that this is going to be main green. Now notice what's going to happen. As we're going to be hovering over the link, the color is going to be changing to a green. Now, last but not least, we have the class of active. Remember, to a very towards one. And just to show that, let's say that this would be an application with a home and about, and the tours would be only in the tours section. Let's write that there's going to be a class of active that shows that we have navigated to that part of the application. So color, and again, let's use the main green. And once we do that, we have our navbar ready. So we have our navbar.js, where we had our links and our logo imported from the source folder. And now this is going to be our Sass file, where we have all our styles. And just like that, we have our first component knocked out, and we're ready to move on to our next component. Now, the next two components that we're going to be creating is going to be tour list, which is going to hold the data about all the tours. And in fact, the single tour, which is going to be either New York or Paris or London or Tokyo in our case. Again, if you're going to have 200 other tours, those are going to represent each and every tour. So that's going to be the second component that we're going to be creating. So again, let's go back to our text editor. Now we're not going to use anymore the styling file for the navbar, and we also are not going to need the navbar.js. And the only thing we're going to need to do with a app.js is to get the tour list. Now, again, let me open up the sidebar just so we can see where we're going to be working. And now let's go back to a components folder. Now, within the components folder, let's add two more folders, which is going to be tour list. And the second one is going to be tour. So basically two more folders. So again, new file, and I'm sorry, not file. We would need a folder. So new folder, and this is going to be tour. Now with a navbar, we created a navbar folder, and within the navbar folder, we created a file of navbar.js. However, we also have an option in the create React app, since it is working with a webpack, where we have the tour, which is going to be representing the each and every tour that we're going to have, or tour list, which is going to have the information. Now, instead of naming the file exactly the same, we can just do it like this, where we have a new file, and within the folder we can just say index.js. Now again, since this tour list is going to have the state, let's do a RCC, which is going to create a new class based component. However, we would need to change the name, because obviously we are going to be importing this. So in this case, let's just change it to, instead of the index, let's use, then let's say that this is going to be tour list. So let's write a tour list. So this is going to be our tour list. And now we're going to be exporting this tour list. Now within the tour list, we're going to write that there is going to be a simple section. So the section and the section over here. And let's say that there's going to be eventually a tour. So let's just write for now that there is going to be a tour. Also within the tour list, there's going to be a Sass. However, if you don't want to, you can just write all your styles in the app Sass file. This is also an option. In my case, I'm going to create the second one, which is going to be a tour list and Sass extension. So let's create a new file. And so the file name is going to be tour list, and let's just call it SC and CSS. So now we're going to have our tour list. Now we would need to import this. So let's go back over here on the top, and let's say that we would want to import this from the tour list CSS. So let's say that there's going to be a tour list. Again, this is going to be in the same folder, tour list, and let's call this SCSS. So this is going to be our styling. Now, why I showed you the index.js, because as you can see, since we're exporting default, there was technically no reason for call this tour list, because either way would be exporting as a default. But the reason for that is we can go back to a app.js, and instead of looking for the navbar, then the second navbar.js, we would just want to import the file from the tour list. So I'm just going to say import from, and now we would need to give it a name. So let's call this tour list, and we would be importing it from the tour list. So since this is not in the same folder, again, we're going to go to components, we're going to do the relative path, then we're looking for the tour list, and we're done. We don't need to go further and look for the navbar.js or navbar in general, because by default, we're going to be exporting this index.js. So from this folder, we're going to be getting this index.js. So once we save this, and once I have the navbar, now the next one is going to be, in fact, the tour list. So let me just place this in the element, because I know I cannot return two components side by side, or two elements, or two divs side by side. So I would need to have some kind of parent container. So in this case, we can just say maybe div, or we can use main, doesn't really matter. And we can just drag the navbar up. And after the navbar, there's going to be our tour list. So we're just going to call this tour list. And again, we need to close it. So there's going to be a tour list. And now this is complaining that expected an assignment will function in the app.js on the line 9. And notice again, the reason for that is because now once we use the prettier, it just added this semicolon at the end, or we can use the parentheses, just grab this main, and once we do that, everything should be working fine once we get rid of it. And now sure enough, we have our tour. So this would be a setup for the tour list. Instead of using exactly the same file name, we can just use the index.js. Now sometimes it gets annoying where you cannot really find it. You're like looking, okay, what is the index in JS in this case? So there's cases where it actually makes a little bit more sense where we're naming them. So for the tour, I'm also going to name it. So again, let's create two files here. One is going to be tour, and the second one is going to be the tour and Sass. This would be for the styling. So let's create a new file. Now this is going to be tour.js. And after that, we would want to have a state in this application. So again, we're going to write RCC. So this is going to create a class-based component and export it as a default. And let's write that this is going to be single tour in this case. And let me just save this. And let's find where we have the tour folder. Within the tour folder, again, let's create a new file. Now in this case, this is going to be tour. And then we're going to have a SCSS. So this would be the Sass extension. And since we will going to use the variables, then right away before we forget, we can just do the import. Then we have the quotation marks. Then we're going to be looking for the index Sass file. So this is going to be not in the same folder. Again, we're looking for the source folder, and we're just going to find it here. So once we do that, we have our semicolon, and we are ready to go. Now, last but not least, in the tour list.js, or in the index.js in this case, we would want to import the tour. So let's go back to the top, and after the CSS, let's just import the tour. So let's write import, and let's call this tour from, and let's look for a different folder, since this is not going to be in the same folder. And now we're looking for the tour. And then since we didn't name it index.js, now we need to look for the actual tour. So let me save this again. And within the section, instead of returning the tour as a name, we're going to be returning as a component. So we're going to write the tour. And now let's check it out. What we're going to have is we have a single tour. Now there's a couple of things that we would want to do here. because this we're now obviously not done. We just have our single tour ready. Now, first we would want to go to a tour and decide what we would want to write over here, whether there's going to be a div or container or image or anything like that. So let's go back to tour. So we're sitting within tour, and let's start writing our JSX. Now we're gonna not have a div. So in this case, we're gonna have the article. So we're gonna write article. So this is gonna be the component that, or I'm sorry, the div that encloses rest of the JSX. So we're gonna call this article. Now within the article, there's gonna be first an image, and the image is gonna be sitting within the card. Now how we're gonna do this? Well, we have the article. So let's right away add a class, and we need to use the class name of tour. Now, once we add the class name of tour, now we're going to be looking for the div, which is going to be the image container. So let's say div, and for the div, we would want the class of image container. Now, within the image container, again, we would want images, because notice all of our tours have images. So let's write that there's going to be an image, and now we need some kind of source. Now, for now, I would just need some dummy data. So let's go back, and let's say that we'd want to open up the new browser window. Let's look for the pixels, because that is the website that I like the most. And let's say anything. So we can use, let's say this one. So let's just copy image address, and let's go back to a source, and we can just do it like this. And now if everything works correctly, we should have some kind of image. Now, obviously, we need to do a little bit of CSS. Otherwise, this is just going to look very, very interesting. But before we do maybe CSS, let's just do a simple width of 200 pixels. So let's just make this picture way smaller so we can see everything else that we're going to be doing. So this would be the image that's going to be sitting within the image container. Now, the reason why we're placing this in the image container, because as we're hovering, if we're going to go back to our project, notice we have this delete button. So we can get rid of this tour. However, this delete button is only showing as we're hovering. So we need first the container where we're going to have the image eventually. And then now we're going to have our button. So let's write that there's going to be a span, because for the font awesome 5, we need to have these parent containers. And let's call this close btn. And later on, we're going to add obviously the event listener, which is going to be on click. But for now, we're just going to have the font awesome icon. Now here, hopefully everything works fine and we get our font awesome icon. So let's say FAS and FA window close. And if you remember, this was one of the first things that we installed in our setup. And sure enough, we have our icon. So everything worked fine, and we are ready to move on. Now, after the image container, notice we have our image container, we're going to have the info. Now, within the info, there's going to be city, then there's going to be also the name of the tour, and then we're just going to have a specific info about this tour. So let's go back, and let's say that we would want a div with a tour info, and within this tour info, we're just going to have first a heading 3, and here we're going to have a dummy data. Now, obviously, like I said, later on, we're going to be working with the state, so we're going to get our data. But here, let's just write city. Then after the city, we're going to have a heading 3, or I'm sorry, heading 4. So let me just delete this, and we're going to have, instead of city, we're going to have a name. So let's write name. And then we're going to have a heading 5, which is going to have a span. And after the span, we're going to have our info. So this is going to be our heading 5 with some text of info. Then there's going to be this button. And then underneath the button, this would be our paragraph that we're going to be toggling later on. So let's go back, and still within this info. Now after the heading 4, there's going to be heading 5. Within heading 5, we're just going to write info. And again, since the font awesome 5 requires to enclose the icons, we're just going to say FAS. And now we would be looking for a icon name of FA, caret, and square down. So this would be the name of the icon. So now we should be getting something like this. Now, last but not least, after the heading 5, we're going to be looking for the paragraph. So in the paragraph, this is where we're going to be placing the info. Again, for now, we're just going to place some dummy data. Later on, we're going to be getting this from the data JSON, or no, I'm sorry, not data JSON, just the file, the data file that we're going to have. So this would be a simple setup for the tour. Now, before we move on, I would want to go to a tour list and add some kind of initial styling for this tour. And let me just make sure, first of all, that we are importing the Sass files for the tour and for the tour list. So before I forget and before we start looking all over the place, let's just say that we would want to import in the same folder, in this case, tour, and we're going to be looking for the Sass files. So let me save this, and also we need to do the same thing in the tour.js, tour list.js. So let me open it up. Or again, I keep forgetting that this is actually an index, and we did it. So everything is working fine. However, we did not add the class name. So we would want for the tour list, add a class name also. So we're going to have a class name and tour list. So now, first, let's add some initial styling to a tour list. So this would be in this Sass file. And next, we're going to work with a tour. Now, the reasoning for that is since we would want some kind of layout, there's going to be one layout if we have one item. And then the moment we're going to run our state, we're going to add more CSS styling or Sass styling just so it looks more presentable. So we would want them to look side by side like this. And if we're going to make the screen size smaller, then we're going to have only one icon. So let's go back and let's look for the tour CSS. And in our case, we're just going to say that we're looking for the tour list. So let's say that we're looking for the class of tour list and what we would want with this tour list. Now, first we would want a width, and we're going to use the view widths. Now, the view widths are percentages from the screen. So this is not 700 pixels. This is not 70% of pixels. This is 70% of the screen width. Now, this is going to be the layout for the single element. Notice how they actually got smaller. However, I would want to place it in the center. So let me go back. Let's say margin 0 auto. So now this is going to be sitting in the center. And then also let's add a little bit of padding. So padding is going to be 2 REMs. And by the way, the reason why we're using the REMs because they are responsive values. So let's say even the user who's using our application has changed the root element, the HTML element, from the 1 REM to 16 pixels to let's say 20 pixels. Then since we're using the REM values, our application is going to be adjusting to that. If you're using the absolute values with the pixels, then you're just pretty much forcing how you would want your application to see. But maybe one of your users doesn't want it to see it that way. So let me save this. Now we'll have a little bit of padding. And like I said, there's going to be a little bit more styles once we add more items. But for now, we're done. So now we can go to a tour and do the styling in the tour. Now, first we had a class of tour. So let's go back. We had this class of tour. And in the tour, we're just going to want to select this class of tour. Now, once we have selected the tour, the class name of tour, let's do a background and let's look for the main gray. So let's write main and gray. And now our tour is going to be the gray. So this just shows that everything is working with our styling. All our imports have been correct and everything is showing exactly how we would want. Then after that, we would want a border radius. So let's say border radius, and let's add a border radius of 0.8 REMs. So let's say border radius 0.8 REMs. So this is just going to give it some border radius. After that, we're going to have a margin, and the margin is used for a smaller screens, because if on a smaller screen, we don't want them to be stacked exactly one on top of each other. So we would want some margin in between. That's why we're just adding margin top and bottom. So once we save this, this is just going to add some margin. Now after that, we would want to work with an image. And like I said, since we're using the Sass, and since the image is sitting within a tour, notice we'll have a tour, and then within the tour we have the image. So I can just go after the tour and then the image. And the only thing I need to do is just nest it. And let's just say for the image, first I would want the width of 100%. Now let's go back to tour.js and let's just remove this width of 200 because this is going to override it otherwise. So let's say for the image width, and let's look for the width of 100%. So sure enough, now our image is 100%. So later on, once we're going to be working with a data images, they're all going to be fitting 100%. But notice we had a border radius. However, this image right now does not have this border radius. So what we would want to do is border or top. So border top, because we would want that radius only on the top. We wouldn't want on the bottom. And let's look for left radius 0.8, and again REMs. And let's change also for border top, and this would be in fact right. So this would gonna be a right border radius. And I believe, again, as always, I messed up with a word of right, which is really interesting. And then last but not least, we would want to have a display of block. So I'm just going to say display of block, and this is going to get rid of it. There's a little bit of margin when we place the image in the HTML. So this display of block just get rid of this margin. So this would be a tour. Now also we have this image container. Remember in the tour.js, we had the image container. Now the image container is going to be relative because we would want to place this icon, this delete icon, with a position absolute. So this is the reason why for the tour, for the image container, we're going to say dot image container, and we're going to be looking for position relative. Now, why were you looking for position relative? Because this is going to be a parent container for our position absolute. And now let's work with this close button. Remember in the tour.js, we had this close button, which was font awesome. So let's go back to a tour SAS file and let's say close btn. Now what we would want is to work with a position absolute. Again, we would want to take it out of the normal flow. So now we say position absolute. We also would want right away display of block because we're going to be adding some padding and we would just want it to respect it. So let's say display of block. So now this is going to be display of block. However, we need to say where we would want it. So first we would say top and 5% from the top. So this would be the position. And again, since this is position relative, then the 5% right now is from the image container. That is the reason why we use this position relative. Now also let's do left, and or you know what, let's write right is going to be 5%. So this is going to be 5%. And after that, let's add right away color so we can see what we're doing. So the color is going to be main green. And sure enough, right now we have our little icon. Let's add a little bit of size. So font size to REMs. So now this is going to grow bigger. And after that, we would have a cursor. So cursor. And let's say cursor is going to be pointer. And after that, we're going to have a little bit of transition. So as we are hovering, the close button is going to be showing. However, we would want to do that with a little bit of transition. So this is again why we're using the transition, where we say transition all 0.3 seconds linear. So this would be our transition. And last but not least, let's do opacity. And let's write that the opacity is going to be 0. So now what's going to happen, this icon is going to disappear. However, it's going to appear and disappear within those 3 seconds, because that's the whole point of this transition. And now let's write for the image container. So let's say image container. Then we're looking for the hover again. And again, we can nest this, but in this way we can also write the same thing. So let's say close button. So as we're hovering over the image container, we would want to show this close button. And for this, let's say opacity. Opacity is going to be 1. So now as I'm hovering, notice now the icon is showing. So this would be the simple CSS that can fix that. And then we're going to have a tour info. And for this, we'll have a tour info class. So tour info. And let's say first we're going to have some padding. So top bottom is going to be 1 REMs, side is going to be 0.5 REMs, and let's just add some background. Let's say that the background is going to be, again, main gray. Now in our case, maybe, you know what, we can just skip this. Let's just leave the background the way it is, because we already set for the whole card, so we might as well just leave the tour info alone. And now we need to work with tour. Remember, we had a tour info, and then we have the whole class of tour. Now we can do a tour info, and then we can be looking for a heading 3, heading 4, heading 5. So let's go back up here, and let's say that within the tour info, we have a heading 3, which would be the first one. So again, we can do some nesting, and let's say text transform uppercase. So we're transforming uppercase, and color is going to be main green. So color, and again, the $, main green. So we have our name, and notice the city right now is green. After we have a heading 4, and within a heading 4, we again do a text transform. Only in this case, this is not going to be uppercase, it's going to be capitalized. And then we'll have a color of main black. So in this case, again, $, main black. So this would be the color for the text. And we're also going to have a little bit of margin 0.2 REMs, 0. So the margin to the top is going to be 0.2. Then left and right is going to be 0, so no margin whatsoever. And the bottom is going to be 0.6. So this is how we would add this margin. So this would be for the heading 4. Now, if you want, you can go back to tour and add classes here. This would also be an option, because in some cases, the nesting is not that great. It would make more sense if you would be going back and adding classes. But since we are working with a JSX, and I don't want to pollute everything with a class names, then this is why we're avoiding class names as much as possible, and we're just working with a nesting in the Sass. And again, there's different ways of thoughts. There's some people who like the nesting, so it's really, again, a lot of it is really a preference. So have a heading 5. Now the heading 5 is going to be our info over here. So let's say text and transform again, and let's write that this would be capitalized. So the info is going to be capitalized. After that, we would want to work with a span. Now, span is where? Well, it is in a heading 5. So again, we can do the same thing where we're working with a span. And again, just to show you where's the span. So the span is sitting within the heading 5. And what we're talking about is this font awesome icon. So we would want to add some styles to it. So first, let's add, again, color of main green in our case. And let me scroll down just so we can see it better. And you know what? I don't think we need it right now, the integrated terminal anyway. So I can close that. Margin, let's add some margin, 0.5 REMs. Font size, 1.2 REMs, so bigger font size for our info, or I'm sorry, for our span in our case. And cursor pointer, so as we're hovering, there's going to be cursor pointer. And we're done, because we could technically go back and add some more styles to this info which we want for the paragraph, but I think that we have done enough CSS for now. So now we can switch back to a React and look at how we can display the list of items that we have right now. Once we're done with styling of tour list and single tour, now let's figure out how we can get all the items that we have in our tours. So let's say, again, in this case, we have 4 tours, but what if we would have 200 tours? So we would need to set up a state in the tour list, and then again, use the map to loop through an array or any kind of data structure and get those tours and show them all on the screen. So let's go back to a tour list. So this would be the index.js for the tour list. And now we would need to create an state. So the great thing is that we have class-based component. So this is as easy as just saying state, and state is going to be equal. And for now, we can just write tours. And let's say that tours is going to be an empty array. So tours is equal to an empty array. Now, in order to work with this video, you would either need to get the setup files that I have, or you would need to create your own data. So let me save this first with a Tours, and let's go back to our setup files. Now, first we looked at a logo PNG, but also we have the images and we have the tour data.js. So first let's grab the tour data.js and let's just copy this. Let's say that within a city tours, we would want to go to the source, then within the components, and then we don't have to go specifically to a tour or tour list, but if you want, you can do that. Now, obviously, it would be easier import if we just paste it over here. But if you don't want to, just paste it somewhere within your components. So just paste it, and we have our tour data.js. Now, the second item in the setup files that we still need to get is the images. And with the images, we need to be careful. You need to make sure that you're copying and pasting exactly in the place that I'm doing. Otherwise, your project is not going to work. So what we need to do is we need to go to the public, not to the source, to a public one, and just copy and paste this folder that we have with an images. And within a few minutes, we're going to see why we're doing that. So let's go back and let's close the setup files and city tours, and let's go to our text editor. Now, again, let me open up the sidebar, and now I need to look for the data. Remember the data that we just copy and pasted. And here we have the data. Now, here I'm just doing a simple export where I have my array and I'm exporting as a tour data. Now, within tour data, again, I'll have the image, which is going to be, I'm going to have the ID, then the name of the city, and then I have an image. And notice the path that I have for the image, because what we need to understand is later on, as we're going to be displaying this, we're going to use this for the source. Now remember, when we worked with an app bar, we used a source that was imported to a file from the logo PNG, which was in a source folder. However, in this case, we're just showing it a path. Now, the second way how we can use the images in the Create React app would be putting them in the public folder. So putting them together with an index.html. And now the path is still relative, but we're not going to the source folder. In fact, we're just saying, hey, listen, this image is going to be in the same folder, and there's going to be an image folder. So obviously, if you're copying pasting separate images, make sure that you're just copying pasting without an image. So within the path, don't show that you have actually an image folder. Again, this needs to match, otherwise this is not going to display anything and you will going to get frustrated really, really fast. So make sure that the path is exactly correct. So if we have images folder, and then we have the file or the name of New York JPEG. And sure enough, if I'm going to go to images, notice I'm going to have London JPEG, New York JPEG, and Paris JPEG. So what I'm saying is, if you're adding one more item here, because this is straight up JavaScript, ID, city, image, name, info. I mean, as easy as it gets. We have a property name, property value, property name, property value. But if you're adding one more image, make sure, or I'm sorry, one more item or 10 more items, make sure that you have, first of all, unique ID, because otherwise your key property is not going to work. And then make sure that you have an image for this. And again, you can use the same one, but I would suggest getting a different image and make sure that this name is going to match. Otherwise, this is not just going to display. So once we have this information and once we know where our images are coming from, let me just close this image and let me close the public. Now, I'm sorry, there's one more thing that I want to let you know. Technically, what you can do is if you have images in your source folder. So let's imagine that if we would grab this folder, the images, and it would be actually in the source folder. We can get them the same way how we imported the images for the navbar. Remember, for the navbar, we did the logo and importing. You can do the same thing with your data. So what you can do is you can go to your data, and if you know that you have images, you can just import them and then use them as a key value. So let's say image, if this would be imported, let's say the name would be New York. And we're going to do this in one of the following the project just so we can cover, but I'm just letting you know that this is also an option. You're not just limited just because this is the data file. we can also do it this way, how we did with the nav bar. But I just wanted to show how we can access the images from the public folder. So now that we have talked for what it seems like an hour about the images, let me just close the source. And you know what, we can might as well right away close the sidebar as well. And let's find where is our tour list, because what we are interested is not just in the tours in the empty array. We need some kind of data here. And for the data, we're going to import this. And we're going to import what? Well, we're going to import tour data. And we have the named import since we don't have the default. So the variable name needs to match. So this would be tour data. So let's say like this, import. And let's say that this would be tour data. Let me just make sure how it was the camel case. So tour data. And now what we are importing from? Well, this is not going to be the same folder, right? So we need to leave the folder. And now notice we have a tour data. So once we import this tour data, we can just set it equal tours to a tour data. Now, easy way how to look at whether everything has worked. Let's go to our render and let's just console log it. What we have in this dot state dot tours. And once we're going to save it, once this is going to render, notice that this is not complaining. Now it says tour data does not contain default export. And my bad, I actually needed to enclose this in the curly brackets because I'm specifically saying what variable I'm getting here. So now once we save it, this should work. So let me go back to inspect. Let me make this a little bit bigger just so we can see the console. And sure enough, we have the array. So we know that everything is working. And again, the reason why would you want to do something like this where you're setting up your state outside is the fact of, look at the size of this. So let's say if you're going to add 200 more, do you think it's going to be easy to maintain your tour list JS, or in our case index.js, where we have the state? And then let's say if we're going to be looking for something. So this just makes your files way more manageable. Because in this case, I know that I'm getting this tour data. So if there's going to be some issue with the data, I can just go to tour data, where I specifically just work with my data. And within the tour list, I'm just working how this is displayed. So now once we have the array, let me just make sure that this is exactly the same array. And sure enough, it is. Now our next step would be displaying, because for now we're just displaying one tour. So how we can do this? Well, there's a couple of options, meaning we can destructure it or we won't gonna restructure it, destructure it. Now in our case, let's just do a little bit of destructuring. We know we have const, so we can access the tours. And I would just want to access these tours in the state. So in this case, I'm just going to write this dot state and what I'm looking for. Well, I'm looking for the tours. So now I have access to a tours array. And again, this is the same array, nothing changed. It's just going to be easier as we're working within our JSX. Now let me just first delete these tours. And now let's remember how we did that. So we had an array. And what I would want is loop through this array and then apply the map method. Now for the map method, there's going to be a callback function that will going to be applied to each and every item in the array. And what I would want is grab this item that is in the array and pass the information to the tour. And then we're going to go to the tour.js and then we're going to display each and every item separately. So once we have the tours and we have access to the tours, let's write our JSX. So we'd want tours and then the method would be map. Now the map is gonna get a callback function, and then this callback function is gonna be applied to each and every item in this tours array. Now this is just gonna be a parameter, so you can name this orange if you want, but if it just makes sense that if you are naming this each and every item in this array, something that reflects what are we looping through. So let's say that as we're looping through and we're using the ES6 arrow function syntax. So in this case, we are just avoiding unnecessary keyword function or anything like that. And now we would be looking for a return. So as we're looping through the method, through the array with a map method, what we would want to do? Well, since we are working with a JSX, we're going to write return. So now we're going to be returning the JSX and we're going to be returning first the tour. So I'm going to say we would want to return the tour. Now, for the tour, we also need to use what? Well, we need the key. Because remember, when we had multiple items that we would want to return, we would want to use the key attribute. So I'm going to write key. And for the key, we're going to say tour ID, since we have access to this ID, and the ID is going to be unique. Now, also what we're looking for is the image, is the city name info. However, I think this would be easier if we're just going to go and we're going to pass the whole tour. So in this case, we could just say tour, and we're going to set it equal to a tour. So now what we're doing is we're passing the whole object here to a prop of tour. And then once we're going to go to a tour, we're going to do a little bit again of the structuring, and then we're going to show each and every item. So let me save this first. And now notice I'm going to have 4 items. However, we're going to have the same info over there because we haven't worked yet on the tour on displaying each and every item. But we know that everything is working because we have 4 items, and we had 4 items also in our array. So far so good. And again, this is plain old JavaScript. All this is we're saying we are mapping over the array, and then as we're mapping through an array, we're creating a new array. Now in this new array, what we're going to have is not just some JavaScript, but in fact, we're just going to pass this JSX, this tour, and all the information is going to be kept within this tour. And then once we do the return, then this new array is going to be displayed. So let's go to a tour.js and let's do a little bit of destructuring. Now we know that we're getting this destructuring from where? Well, we're getting it from the props. So now again, let's do a destructuring. So let's say const, and now let's look for the items that are in there. So we have what? And let me just see, since we were console logging, this should be still showing. And notice that it's saying that it's not over there. So let me go back to tour data. We have city, image, name, and info. Let me just check the index.html. Did I console? Oh yeah, I deleted the console log, so that's why you cannot see. So maybe it's going to be easier for us if we just do a console log, and let's look for this dot state tours, and let me save this. And now sure enough, we have our array. Now once we have the array, now we have the ID of 1, city, image, and the other items. So let's go back to tour, and now let's look for them. So first would be city, then we'll have an image, then we're going to have a name, and then we're going to be looking for the info. So these are the items that are in our array. And this is all going to be located in what? Well, we're passing down the object. Now, what is an object? Well, this is an object that is going to be in our index.js, and we have the prop of tours, and within the tour, we have this tour object. So each and every item as we're looping through. So let's go back here and let's say this dot props, and then we need to look for the tour. And then within the tour, we're going to have all these items. And now only thing left to do is just change the values that we're going to have so far. So we have an image. Well, it's not going to be anymore the image from the pixels. This is going to be the image that we're getting back from our item. So here we're going to say that we're looking for the image. So this would be our first variable. Then we're looking for the name. So this would be city. So again, let's do a city. After that, we're going to have just a separate name. So again, variable of name. And then we'll have an info, which is going to be all the way in the bottom. So let's write here that this is going to be a info. And now notice whether everything is going to work exactly the same how we want it. Now let me go back, let me close this. And sure enough, what we're going to have here is the 4 tours that we had. So the first one is going to be New York, and notice how we have unique values, New York Bridge, the different type of image. Then this would be a Paris Lights tour. Again, now the info, I was just too lazy to write something unique, so my apologies, but you understand the idea. Tour data, this is the info. If you want to write something unique, you're more than welcome to do that. Then we have London, and then here this is going to be a Tokyo. And just like that, we get information from our tour data. Then we pass it to a tour list via import. Then we'll set it to the state, and then we just loop through this data using the map method, and we're displaying each and every item in this array using the tour, and we're just passing down the information. Now within the tour, we just grab that information and we just display it on the screen. And now let me just delete maybe of the console log, and now we can move on and maybe do a little bit of quick styling because we have already multiple items on the page. Once all our data is displayed, we should feel really good about ourselves, because this was probably the most important part, because the rest of it is just going to be tweaking our application. Now in this part, we're just going to look at two things. First of all, we're going to look at the CSS or SAS, and we're going to look at how we can create a column layout. And the second one, we're going to discover how we can show and hide this info for each and every tour. And let's start with a styling. Now, as you can see that while everything is displayed correctly and it looks really good on a small screen, there's an issue if we're making our screen size bigger. And notice that this is still going to be 70% of the screen size. So this is not something that we would want. We'd probably want something along the lines of this, where depending on a screen size, we're going to have a different amount of columns. And for this, we need to go to a tour list, and let me just make this smaller, and not just tour list.js or index.js, but we need to go to a SAS file. And we need to work with a media queries. And media queries allows us to style certain elements, and I'm meaning by the elements that we're selecting at a certain screen size. So let's say media. So this is going to be the selection, and we're going to say screen. And now we need to decide what kind of screen. So let's start with 768 pixels. So the syntax would be min width. So starting from 768 pixels. Now up until the 768 pixels, this is going to be our layout. So this is going to be the styling. However, starting from 768 pixels, we're going to add some different styles. And we're going to say tour list. So we're going to be still targeting the tour list. And then let's write that we would want to display grid. So we would want to make a column layout. And if we want to make a column layout in the grid, we would need to use the property of grid template columns. And here we would need to specifically write what kind of columns, how many columns, and how the columns should look like. So when we use the fraction values, what we mean is that the size is going to be distributed equally. So starting from 768, I would want 2 columns. So I'm just going to write that there's going to be 2 columns. Now I have 2 items, but grid implicitly is going to create another row where there's going to be another 2 columns. So it sees that, you know what, you just need 2 columns. So even if you're going to have more items, I'm just going to create them just exactly you want to. And one fraction just means that they're going to be distributed evenly. Now, also we would want some space in between them. So we have a property of grid, column, gap, and here we just need to write what kind of gap. So let's say 1.5 REMs. So once we save this, let's notice what's going to happen. As my screen size gets bigger, check it out. So first, this is going to be one big tour, and then we're going to have 2 tours. So this is going to be look that we're looking for. So as we get bigger than 768 pixels, then we're going to have a 2-column layout. And what we would be interested is 2 more breakpoints. One is going to be for 992, and the last one is going to be for 1140. And since we already have all our syntax set up, the only thing we need to do is just grab this media. So let's just grab this rule that we had and copy and paste it 2 times. Now, as we're copying and pasted, we just need to delete some stuff, because whenever we set up with the minimum width, regardless if we're going to write 992, the tour list is already going to be display grid unless we're going to override it. So we can just get rid of this property and the value, because the browser is going to understand that if you set it up as a grid starting from 768, even though you're going to go to 992, unless you're going to override it somewhere here, this is already going to be displayed of grid. So our interest is only changing the column size, because if it's 768, we would want 2 columns. If we get to 992, you know what? Let's make 3 columns. And the same goes for grid column gap. We don't have to write every time the gap. Only thing we can do is just delete the gap, because the gap is going to stay again the same regardless of if we're going up the screen size, because we already have set it up in the min width of 768. And moreover, if we set something before the media screen, this is just going to start automatically. So unless we override it here, this is still going to be implied. So let's get rid of the, you know what? No, we need to get rid of the grid. Now we have grid template columns, and now we just need to change, first of all, finish with the screen sizes, and second, we need to discover what columns we would want. So let's say 1140 pixels, and then for the 992, let's write repeat. And again, this is a function that takes 2 variables or 2 parameters. First one is how many columns, and the second one is what would be the size of the columns. Now, again, you can write here 7 columns if you want, and you can write 300 pixels. But again, I'm using the 1 fraction because that just distributes it evenly. Now, you could have written this exactly like this: 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1 fraction. It would do still the same thing. It's just easier using the repeat. Now, I'm going to leave this for now. Just remember that this is the reason for repeat. And let's write repeat over here. Repeat. And you know what? Let's make 4 columns. So 4, 1 fraction. Now, there's one more thing that I would want to add. Now, remember, with a tour list, we started with a 70 view width, so 70% from the screen. As we go, the screen size, in fact, I would want to add this. I would want to go back and I would want to say, you know what? We're just going to use more than 70%. Let's use, let's say 85. So let me go back and let's say that within the tour list where we had for 992, and let's write the size. So width is going to be, instead of 70 view width that we had before, we're going to have 85. Let's save this, and now everything should be working. And now we have the New York, and obviously as we're going to be going up with a screen size, then we're going to get up to 3. Now, I don't want to ruin my side-by-side layout right now. So what we're going to do is we're just going to leave it, and you have to trust me, or you need to check it out on the bigger screen yourself, that this is going to be 4-column layout. Because if I'm going to make this full screen size, then that means, again, I'm going to have to put them side by side, which is not hard, but I would like to avoid that as much as possible. So your layout is going to look something like this if you're going to make it full-size screen. So that's the whole point of using the grid. Now, next, we would want to work with this info. So that was the last of the styling that we had to do for this project. So those of you who hate CSS, apologize, but I had to do some kind of styling. Otherwise, it looks very ugly. And that was the last of the styling that we did for this project. Now, next we have the tour.js, where we would want to display the info. Now, for displaying the info, we would need to work with a conditionals in the JSX. Now, there was 3 ways how we could work with a conditionals in the JSX, but I'm just going to work with a Boolean and add. Now, for this, we would first need to set up some kind of value in the state. So we would need to first say that there's going to be a state. And again, since this is a class-based component, it is very easy. And let's write show info. This is going to be my property. And the value is going to be, first of all, false. So first things first, this is going to be false. Now let's go down to where is the paragraph, and let's use the conditional rendering that we talked about before in the tutorial. So let's say that first I would want to create a for the JSX, the parentheses for the JSX, and here I'm going to write this dot, and then we're going to have state, and let's write show info. So now I'm looking for the value of this property. So within the state, I have the key value pairs, and my key is going to be show info. And what is the value? Well, the value is false. And now if I'm saying if it is true, then I would want to show the info. And if it is not true, then it's not going to be shown. So here we would need to use the Boolean and in the JavaScript, if the first value is true, then we always return the second one. So in this case, let's just grab this paragraph. Let's just cut it out and copy and paste it here. And now, obviously, since they're false, all of them are going to be hidden. Now, once we are done with setting up this to false, we would also need to set up this click handler where we had this span, so this font awesome icon. And what we would want is, as we're clicking on the icon, then we're going to show for the specific tour the info. Now, how do we do this? Well, again, first we would need to set up a method, and the method is going to be handle info, and we're going to create this as an arrow function because I don't want to bind it, because I want to have this function not to create its own context. So basically, we're not going to bind it in the constructor, and we're going to say this. And now we need to use the method of set state. And now what we're looking for in the set state, well, we would want to have a show info, and we would want to toggle it. So when it's not showing, once we press, we would want to show. When it's showing, when we press, then we would want to hide it. So how do we do this? Well, we have this exclamation mark. Now, exclamation mark is going to mean the opposite. So in our case, we're going to write, so show info is going to be equal to the opposite value of what we have right now. So again, we're going to look for this dot state show info. And now we're saying, you know what? Every time we're going to click it, we're going to flip the value. If it was false, then it's going to be true. If it is true, then this is going to be false. And this is a perfect example, what shows, well, okay, I'm not going to use the word perfect example, but this is a great example that shows that each and one of these tours, these components, have their own state. Because if I'm going to go to the span, and if I'm going to say the on click, so once we click it, and we're going to assign this method that we just created in the class, and the name was this dot handle info. So the name was handle info, and we need to use this dot because we would want to access this. And once we're going to click it, the info is just going to show on the tour that we're clicking on. Notice it is showing on the New York tour. Now, rest of them are still false. And if we want, we can again go back to a React developer tools. So we have the inspect, and then we're also going to have the React developer tools. So let's look for the React. And we're going to have the components here. So let's look for the components. Let me make this a little bit bigger and let's check it out. So we have our tour list. Now within the tour list, this would be our first tour. Now what is the tour? Well, you notice it has the show info of true. So now this is showing. So if I'm going to click it to false, notice now my show info in the state is going to be false. And again, I'm not going to show with the rest of them because this is exactly the same thing. But the idea is that this allows us to control each and every component separately because we have a way of setting it in the state. And now we have our click handler, which handles if we click the span, then we show the info. And if we click again, when the info is shown, the info is hidden. The last part of the project is the fact of setting off the span, so these icons, where once we click the icon, the tour is going to disappear from the view. So as we're hovering, let's say that we're definitely not interested in London, we just click it and this is not displayed anymore. So that particular component is not being rendered. Let's say we don't like Tokyo, we don't like Paris, and last but not least, we don't like New York. Now, obviously, again, like moment we're going to refresh the page, all of them are going to be shown. But what we're going to do is how we can just remove each and every separate item. Now for this, we need to go back to our tour list or the index.js in the tour list, and we need to create another method. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to pass that method down to a tour. And then once we're going to click that span or that icon, then the tour is going to be hidden. Now, like I said, we need to start by creating a method. Let's call this method, and we're going to be looking for a remove tour. So this would be the method name, and that obviously would have to be above the render. And this method, so we're going to be creating it as a arrow function, is going to take one parameter, and that parameter is going to be an ID. Now, what we're going to have in the function body? Well, first we would need to the structure. Well, you don't have to do this, but I just find this a little bit easier, where we have const and we're just looking for tours, and we're looking for the tours in where we're looking for tours in state. So now we're getting these tours. Now, once we're gonna have the tours, we would need to filter them. However, notice that the webpack is complaining because I wanted to do as a arrow function, but obviously the actual arrow is missing. So once we add the arrow, now everything should be working fine and there should be no errors displayed. And what we would want is, as we click this, so as we get this method rolling, we would want to filter the tours, so all the tours that we're going to have, and we would want to display only the tours that do not match this ID, so the ID that we're going to be passing in. So for this, let's create a const and let's call this filtered, or we can call this sorted tours, whatever, sorted tours, and this is going to be equal to a tours, what we destructured from the state. And again, you could have just written this dot state dot tours and then again filter, but I just did it with a little bit of destructuring. And then let's call this filter, and now we would want to filter. Now the filter, similar like map, loops through an array and uses a function, callback function, and applies it to each and every item in the array. Now again, it is a callback function, so we can write it as a arrow function. Now in this case, I'm going to say that there's going to be a tour, and since this is just only one item, I can omit the parentheses, and as I'm looping through this array, I would just want to look for tours that do not match the ID, because I'm passing here the ID, and I would just want to display the rest of the tours that do not match the ID. Let's say the tour ID 1 or tour ID 2. So in this case, as I'm looping through, I'm just going to say, you know what, return only the tours with an ID that do not match the ID that I'm passing. Because again, with a filter, you're going to get a new array. Now in our case, we set up a condition where only the tours that do not match the ID are going to be placed in that new array. So once we have this information, our filter is set up, and notice the implicit return that we had with a arrow functions. And once we have that, then let's work with a this.setState. So this.setState. So now we would want to change the state. And again, we're not changing the state. We're not going directly and saying, you know what, state, just you change to something. We're not saying state. We're using the method this.setState. Now this.setState allows us to change the values. So in our case, we're going to say tours are going to be equal to a sorted tours. So this is the array that we're getting back from this tour filter. So once we have this information, now the only thing left to do is pass this method. So to pass this method of remove tour. Now, like I showed in the tutorial, there's two ways how we can do this. Now I'm just going to choose the remove tour. So I'm adding remove tour prop to my tour component as I'm passing the information down, and then I'm going to set it equal to this method. So in order to access the method, we need to say this dot, because again, this is a class. So in our case, we're saying this dot remove tour, but again, we're not putting the parentheses here. We're not calling it as the tour is being rendered. We just passing the reference. So that would be the first thing. So we pass remove tours. And you know what? Let's just call it the same. Remove tour is going to be equal to a remove tour. Now this would be with a tour list. Now let's go to a tour.js, and now we would need to again use a destructuring to get that value. So in this case, let's just say const, and this is going to be on the props. So we're going to call this remove tour, and you know what? This should be a curly braces. So my apologies. And once we have the curly braces, this is going to be again in the props object. So let's just write this dot props. And now let's find where is our icon. So where's the icon that's going to be doing the removing? And let's add a event listener. Now we're going to be listening for a click event. So again, we're going to say on click. And once we're going to have the on click, now we would need to pass the remove tour. So in this case, since again, this is going to be the variable, we need to use the curly braces. However, we need to pass the ID, Remember, the ID is that what we're interested in. So we need to go back to a tour data. I'm sorry, not tour data, to the tour list. And as we're passing the tour, notice we're passing all the information, including the ID. So we're good. So we're passing the whole tour. So within the tour, we can go back and we can say we would be looking for the ID. So this would be a specific ID for each and every component. Now, once we have the ID, we would want to pass this in what? Well, in the remove tour, since this is the method that's looking for that ID in order so we can filter the data. So here, let's write ID. However, again, this is wrong because we are calling this function right away. We're saying, you know what, the moment this is going to show up, just run this function. And this is not correct. And just to show you how this works, notice we're going to have a complaint. We're going to say cannot read the property tours of undefined. And that is actually a different mistake. I apologize for that. This should be state. I'm sorry, this wasn't the mistake that I was talking about. But anyway, this is not going to be rendering. And if we're going to go to inspect, and if we're going to check it out, what is the issue? Notice we're going to have a console log. We're going to have the cannot update during an existing state transition. So we cannot do that. We cannot just pass the function. We need to pass the reference. So how we can fix this, because we still want to use the ID. Now this does not change. We still want to use the ID. So what we are doing is we are passing here a anonymous, or all the arrow functions are anonymous. So we're just passing the arrow function, and we're using the fact that arrow functions have the implicit return. And the only thing left to do is just pass here this value of the remove tour. So all we're saying is, you know what? Yeah, run this arrow function, but this arrow function is going to return this function. So once we're going to click it, then we're going to be able to remove the tour. So once we're going to save this, notice what's going to happen. Again, we're going to have our tours. Let me just make this smaller. And now if everything goes correctly, once I'm going to click it, notice the first one is gone. Now, if you want to console log the ID, you can obviously console log the ID. So let's say this would be in the remove tours. Let's say that first we would want to console log the ID. Log, and this is going to be the ID. So obviously for all of them, the ID should be different. This is why we're able to remove the item. So let me make this again bigger, my developer tools, and let's look at again in the console. And once I'm going to click it, check it out. So the ID was 2. So the method looked for the ID of 2. Now it found that it is ID of 2, and then it filtered rest of the array. And we got back all the items that don't have the ID of 2. So this is how it would work with a looking for the item and removing specific item from the array. After working so hard on our project, we would definitely want to put it up online. And this is exactly what we're going to do in this part of the project. Now, in order to follow along this part of the project, you will going to need three things. First one, you're going to need a Git, and I'm not going to go through a install. However, the commands that we're going to do are very simple, and the install is also very straightforward. So first things first, you will going to need a Git. And the second one is you're going to need a GitHub account. And again, I assume if you're watching the video about React, you probably already have your GitHub account set up. And again, there's plenty of tutorials online that show you how to do that. And third, that we'll need a Netlify. Now, this is not a paid service, so you're not going to have to pay anything, but I would suggest signing up right away with a GitHub, because this is a setup that we're going to be using to put our project online for free. So if you don't have one of these things, please pause the video, sign up for Netlify, get GitHub, sign up for GitHub, and get Git installed. So once you have all these three things ready to go, let's go back to our project. And again, you can either do it through a integrated terminal, or you can just go with your terminal and find the project that is, in our case, sitting in the desktop. Now I'm going to do this with a integrated terminal, and notice now I have my integrated terminal ready to go. However, I have my developer server. So I wouldn't want that. So I'm just going to close this out. So I'm just going to say, you know what? I don't want the dev server. Now I'm just going to close the dev server. As we have closed the dev server, let's go back to a GitHub and let's start a new repository. So I'm just going to say new repository and let's call this React City Tours. And I believe I'm going to have to say 2 because I already created one. So let me just copy and paste this for now. Or you know what? I don't need to copy and paste it. I don't know what I'm talking about. I just need to say React City Tours. So the name of your repository. So let's create the repository. And then you would be interested in this line where we have the git remote add origin. So this is what we're looking for. So after all these lines, you would be looking for this git remote add. This is something that you would need to copy right now in your clipboard. So once you have copied this in the clipboard, by default, the create React app is a git repository. So it's already initialized. So the only thing we need to do is just add the files that we would want to submit. So in this case, we're going to say git add. And you know what, in this case, let me zoom in. Since we will going to be using only terminal, we're not going to be doing anything with the JS files. And we're going to say git add. And now we have an option. We can just say the, let's say index or CSS or JS. Now in our case, we're just going to say add them all. Now when I say add them all, since this is already initialized as a git repository, notice we have this git ignore. And again, now I would need to make this smaller, but in the git ignore file, we have all the things that are gonna be ignored when we are doing this git add all. So that would mean all. Now in this case, it helps us because we don't need to go specifically and say what we would want to ignore. We're just gonna say git add all, and we already have our ignore file ready. So once we click this, we have added this. Now we would want to commit. So we're going to say git commit, and we would need to have some kind of message. So in our case, we're just going to say first commit or initial commit. It doesn't really matter. You can write whatever you would like over here. Just remember that it's going to be publicly seen. So probably don't write something nasty or anything like that. So once we do this, notice that it commits all these files. And this is where we would need to copy and paste this information that we had with git remote add. And once we copy and paste it, again, it runs. And now last but not least, we would need to run the command that would push it to a GitHub. So once I click return, notice again, we're starting a new line. Now let me clear the console just so we can see it better. And once we clear the console, then we're gonna write git push. So this would be the name of the command. Then we're gonna use the flag where we're just gonna say -u. And we're going to say origin master. So this is where we're specifically saying how we would want to push this. And now notice the git starts working and it is pushing up to a GitHub. And if everything goes correctly, you shouldn't have any errors and it should be pushed up to your repository. So when you're going to go back and if you're going to refresh, notice we have our project. Everything is great. Now this would be the first part. Obviously, this is on the GitHub. Now you would want to work with a Netlify. So now you'd want to put it online. So again, you would need to sign up for a Netlify, and I would suggest signing up with a GitHub because in fact, we're going to use the GitHub to display the project. And notice that I already have the city tours because I obviously showed you in the introduction. So now we would need to look for the new site from Git. And this is what you're going to have. As you're going to open up the Netlify, you have no sites probably, obviously in the beginning, but as you're going to be working, you're going to be getting more and more sites. Now, these are the sites that we're just going to be using for this React project. So this is why they're sitting over here. Now, as you have the new site from Greg, let's just click it here. And obviously we're looking for a GitHub. So we're going to click it on the GitHub and notice as you're going to sign it up, it's going to authorize you. So that's the beauty here that you don't need to drag and drop the folder, which you can do with the Netlify, just by the way, but it's going to be faster if you're doing this with a GitHub. So notice these are going to be my JavaScript ones. And here we're going to be looking for the React and we're looking for city tours too. So this is what we created. And the only thing we need to do is just click it. That's all. There's nothing else we need to do. Now, Git is going to know that, Netlify is going to know that it needs to run the build And then once we build it, then this is going to be online. So only thing left to do is just click deploy site. Again, you don't need to change anything. You don't need to add any kind of specifications. This is as easy as it gets. I'm just going to click deploying the site, and sure enough, deploying has started. Now, there is a way for you to set up a custom domain. First of all, you can just go to site settings and rename your site. So let's notice you have a confident booth something A9 FCD2. Now, obviously, you would want to have something more related to the project. So in this case, let's just write again React City Tours, and I believe I already have some kind of name, so I'm going to say 2 or version 2, and hopefully this is going to work. Now, however, notice that with all of the not custom ones, you'll have this netlify.com. But again, this is an easy solution. You can just either add your custom domain name, which you have bought it from cheap name or something like that, or you can just make one that is going to be on your custom domain name, like your, let's say, I don't know, name, and the rest of them you just leave them with this Netlify name. And then you can use it in your portfolio where you just have links to these sites, because this site is live. So everything is working. So let me go back to a GitHub and notice it already has deployed. So we have React City Tours version 2. So once I'm going to click it over here, and once we're going to go to the URL, sure enough, we are online. So the whole world can see our amazing project. Now there's one more thing that I want to show you, which is I find really, really powerful about this whole setup with a GitHub and with a Netlify. And that is the fact that if we're going to change anything in the project, and if we're going to push it up to a GitHub, Netlify is going to scour through our GitHub and automatically, without us telling them, is going to add these changes. So let me show you how this would work. Let's imagine that we would want to have a different background. So for the whole body, we would want the background to be green. Now, obviously, this is not something that you would do, but I just want to show you something dramatic just so you can see that the change is happening. So let's go back to the file. We had our index CSS where we had the whole body. Let's scroll down and let's say for the whole body, instead of main white, we're going to say main green. So once we save this, then again, we need to add it to a GitHub. But just make sure that you save the file. Don't go through all with the git commands and then notice that you haven't saved the file, because this is not going to work. So again, we need to do the same thing. We're going to say git add. So we're adding whatever has been changed. Then we're going to do git commit. And let's write that this is going to be a message. Background color changed. So background color changed. And once we have this commit message, notice it says, well, we have one file. There's one insertion and one deletion. Okay, so far so good. And again, now we don't need to write again what we had before, where we had the path name. Now we already have the path name. So we need to skip whatever we're copying, pasting from the clipboard. Only thing we need to do is git.push. And again, we're going to say u and origin master. That's it. Again, we press return. And now this is being pushed up to a GitHub. So what you're going to notice is once the Netlify is done working, you'll notice a completely different background. And that is the true power of when you're working with a GitHub and with a Netlify. Because again, it's going to go and look for the changes that we're adding in our GitHub. And then the moment this is going to be done, there's going to be a brand new site, meaning the changes have been applied to the site you already have. And you don't have to deal with, again, I don't know, going to a GitHub and getting a new values or anything like that. Notice green background. That's it. We didn't have to do anything. We didn't have to touch anything. It automatically went to GitHub. It found whatever changes we made. So basically, obviously, the moment we make changes to the GitHub signals to a Netlify, and I'm not going to go into nitty-gritty details about how it happens, but the idea is very simple. The moment we make changes in our local environment and we push it up to a GitHub, we are live and the changes have been made also live. So this would be the end of this project. I hope you guys enjoy the project and I hope to see you on the next project.